Hello everyone, Nathan P. Butler here, and this is mini Q&A number 20 for the YouTube channel here. The last of these was back in November of 2022. We had a couple of questions get asked, not many, but I felt like, it's been a few months. Let's go ahead and knock out another of these mini Q&As to at least answer those couple of questions, and that'll sort of hopefully spark more of these coming up in the future here. If you want your questions answered or potentially answered in a future mini Q&A, typically what you'll do is put your questions in the comments on the current episode, and then I grab those for the next episode. Every once in a while, I have to record several at a time, so you'll be looking at the t-shirt or whatever to be able to tell when you could drop questions for the next batch, but in this case, it'll just be one episode, so if you want your questions answered in mini Q&A number 21, or if there's tons of them, maybe a couple around the time, then put them in the comments for this one, number 19, which is being posted here in April 2023. And it is a little washed out here color-wise, I notice. It just happens to be the time of day here in the Atlanta area with a window over here and an overhead light there. But I did want to go ahead and give you guys this angle on seeing the collection and everything behind me. The same angle that I typically use for the exclusive Nobility of the Butlerniverse Q&A episodes, the last of which will be being recorded in May. And I actually think we're going to talk about that because somebody asked about the Patreon here as one of the questions. So let's dive in to your two questions from the audience here from underneath number 19 of the mini Q&As for number 20 here. So, first question, and I must say, the way these are set up now, something changed with the way that YouTube does its comment tracking, so that when I go in here to see a comment, it actually doesn't tell me the person's name. It's giving me basically a username instead. So I'll have to go by username as I respond to these. So the first here comes from @JamesLauner. See, that one's easy because it's his name. He asks, has Cade, that is my 4-year-old son, seen Star Wars yet? If not, which order will you show them to him? So he's seen a little bit. He's watched a bit of like Clone Wars and Resistance and Bad Batch and stuff like that as my wife and I have been watching it. He'll be in the room like as we're watching like Book of Boba Fett or Mandalorian and whatnot. So he's seen a little bit in that sense. He can tell you what Star Wars is. He recognizes Grogu, for instance. And I've been watching Star Wars stuff to try to see what he would actually watch when he was very, very little. But it's not like we've had an intentional, hey, let's all sit down and watch Star Wars type of thing specifically to get him into it. My guess would be it'll probably be animated stuff that we introduce him through, whether it's any of the series that are out now, maybe that upcoming Young Jedi Adventures or whatever it's called, just to get him a chance to kind of get into it in a format that he's used to. If I were introducing him to the films directly, my guess would be I'd probably start him with the OT, more than likely, because the prequels are a bit darker, at least once you get to Revenge of the Sith in particular, and the sequel trilogy tonally, I think you kind of need the other films to really get into those. I don't know how well they stand on their own, and they do have some darker tones from time to time as well. So I think the OT is probably the place to go if I were introducing him through live action. But again, it'll probably be animation in some form. Hard to say which. Depends on when he kind of shows more of that interest and willingness to kind of sit down and watch something. These days, it's sort of a turn on something and I'll just play, and it'll be playing in the background kind of stuff. Whether it's Nick Jr., or it's Mickey Mouse Clubhouse on Disney+, or more recently, you just turn on the NHL network so he can watch some hockey type stuff in the background. Or sometimes he's like, ESPN! He wants to watch like live sports of any kind just playing in the background. But not really focusing on it, more just kind of doing his own thing just to have that in the background. So Star Wars may wait a little bit, but he does like watching it with Daddy and Mommy. It's just a question of getting him to actually watch it where he's like choosing to watch it, and something a little bit more directed of getting him actually into it. And then the only other question from this one comes from Ind Hall, @IndHall. Hey there, Nathan. Used to listen to you and the rest of the Republic Forces radio cast. Always loved hearing your continuity corner. If you could go back in time to your final episode of Republic Forces Radio Network over the Clone Wars, what would you tell yourself and the team? Also, I'm thinking of joining your Patreon. What stuff could I expect if I'm missing those old Republic podcast episodes? Do you still review new media? So as far as new media goes, it tends to come up more often just in instances like this, like people doing a Q&A type thing and asking my thoughts on a particular show. I don't do like end cap, recap type things now that I'm not on Star Wars Beyond the Films anymore. I'm not podcasting technically anymore. That's not really the purview of the Patreon. Although typically in the exclusive Q&A episodes that happen each month while the Patreon's still going, there's only one more after the one I recorded today. That is often what the subscribers, whatever you want to call them, the supporters will talk about or will ask about. So, for instance, in the episode I just recorded before recording this mini Q&A, I was asked my thoughts, kind of recapping thoughts on Bad Batch Season 2 and on Mandalorian Season 3, along with a question about Disney versus things like Paramount and their approaches to physical media of streaming stuff. So that stuff does come up, but typically it's not like it's being put out there sort of like standard content. It's more just if somebody asks and I haven't answered it recently, time to answer it again in video format or whatever it might be. So before getting into the Patreon stuff, to go back to the Republic Forces Radio Network stuff. Those were fun times, I must say. If there is anything, though, that I would tell us at the end of that process, one would be, hey, there's going to be a 7th season. It would have been nice to be able to get together to do something with the 7th season, but we were all kind of scattered to the winds. It was getting very difficult to record by the time Republic Forces Radio Network ended. In particular, I think if there's one thing that stands out to me, it's that I would have basically said, don't cover Rebels. I love Rebels. Rebels is my favorite Star Wars animated series at this point. Clone Wars has some amazing stuff in the back half, but boy, those first seasons in some cases were really rough. Love me some Rebels. But we only got through, I think it was 2 seasons of it. Because of the same thing that was causing issues for Republic Forces Radio Network, it was extremely difficult to find a time to get the team together when you have people on in Central, in Eastern, in Pacific, all trying to get together to record for X number of hours regularly on nights when you're also having other stuff in life that you've got to do. Others had kids. I eventually wound up with a kid, but that was after that point. It's just a very difficult thing. I find that when I was younger, when I was more heavily into the audio stuff and the podcasting and everything, starting in 2002 onward, I didn't have a lot of other stuff I was juggling except for work. And then eventually things just kind of keep spiraling, get married, have a kid, and so on. Life doesn't necessarily find a way so much as get in the way in some cases, and you have to make some priority choices. And the result was that we got to a point where it was just frustrating as hell to get anything recorded for the Rebels coverage from Star Wars Report's Rebels Roundtable. It wasn't going to happen. There was no way we were going to get an untold number of further seasons done of that. So I always will look back at that and be frustrated because, in essence, I've done a lot of podcasts over the years. I mean, I haven't recently. Last stuff I was on was, unless you count the Patreon stuff, last stuff I was on, of course, was Star Wars Beyond the Films and Cloud City Casino. But I've done tons. Chrono Radio, Fan Audio Made Easy, Fan Audio News Source, the Butlerniverse, the EU Review, and so on and so on. Plus all the guest spots on things like EU Cast and Star Wars Action News and Star Wars On Direct. I was everywhere. I was heavy into that stuff, not to mention the audio drama stuff. Lots and lots and lots of stuff. But I would say, looking back on it, that there are 3 attempts at podcasting podcasts, that still to this day kind of make me go, dang it, because I think of them as failed ventures. Chrono Radio, I think of as a success. Fan Audio Made Easy, a success. EU Review, for what it was at the time, a success. Beyond the Films, massive success compared to what I could have expected. Being on Republic Forces Radio Network, which was not something I started, I came in a couple seasons into it. Massive fun and successful, etc., etc. And this is all, of course, by the standards of their eras. Like, there was a time early in podcasting, if you got 100 people listening to your show, that was freaking amazing. Whereas now, 100 is nothing. You might as well stop if it's only 100, which actually, makes me wonder about some of the Patreon stuff, because I'm betting some of it's only being listened to by like 10 or less people, which, we'll get into here. But the 3 that stand out to me as kind of the failed ventures. One is a series that I started very early on. I want to say, gosh, I forget when it was, so I guess I shouldn't say a date because I'm not 100% sure. It would have been like early 2000s, a little while after Chrono Radio had premiered. I tried to have a series called Other Voices, The idea was we were growing as this little small tight-knit podcasting community, and we had a lot of people listening to all the shows and commenting and a lot of lively discussion on places like, at that point, the galacticsenate.com had a special area of a forum specifically for StarWarsFanWars.com that I ran as a hub for Star Wars Fan Audio. But you had this tight-knit group, and you had a lot of people with interesting opinions and interesting perspectives who didn't have shows of their own. So the idea behind Other Voices was have guests create their own audio segments of what they want to talk about. All they have to do is record the one time and maybe edit one time if I wasn't the one editing. Give me that content that they recorded, then I would put together a segment-based show called Other Voices. I'd be kind of like the executive producer, kind of leading off and ending possibly, but then you'd have your segments about interesting topics from different perspectives from people who aren't otherwise hosts of their own shows. It lasted two episodes. First one went okay, kind of fell apart trying to get stuff together for the second, so I wound up doing like a last little segment, and that was it. Other Voices went nowhere. The second one, was a side series of a series I did. As I was doing Chrono Radio, I wanted to also talk about non-Star Wars stuff, so I launched a thing called The Butlerniverse as a podcast. Butlerniverse was non-Star Wars stuff until Chrono Radio ended. Still wanted to talk some Star Wars, so I actually created a little sub-series of it called Chrono Radio Series 2 as a sub-series of episodes for the Butlerniverse. Similarly, I had done some film commentaries back with Chrono Radio. I did a New Hope commentary there for Butlerniverse, had that as kind of a separate little side series to be able to see that. The other side series, though, that I tried to do, or sub-series, whatever you want to call it, within Butlerniverse was called Sith Eye. If you're not familiar, I don't know if it still exists, but back in the day, back in the early to mid-2000s, there was a show on Fox News. I'm a big news junkie. I like watching all the different perspectives from different news channels, depending on which host happens to be on at the time. At the time, I think I was a little bit more diverse in what I was watching as opposed to now. Though these days, I think part of it is I'm looking for actual information, in some cases not propaganda all the time, depending on what channels you're looking at. Whereas at the time, I was just kind of taking in a little bit of everything. And there was a show in the evenings that was weird. It was on at like midnight or sometime late at night, and it was hosted by a guy named Greg Gutfeld, who I think is just kind of a regular Fox host now. But basically it was like news and discussion from a snarky, sarcastic, trying to be funny, kind of weird way. It was a bizarre format that I thought was kind of interesting and tried to do for some side Star Wars episodes called Sith Eye as opposed to Red Eye for Butlerniverse. Lasted one episode, had one guest, Jim Perry, went over like a lead balloon, never did it again. Which leads me to Star Wars Reports Rebels Roundtable. That one I think went much better than either of the other two. We got 2 full seasons out of it. Great discussion about Rebels. We enjoyed doing it, and it was nice to continue on with a slightly different team coming out of Republic Forces Radio Network. But the fact that it was so damn difficult behind the scenes for that show all the time made it so that there was no way it was going to be able to persist. And it was either going to be miserable trying to make it work or end it. And really, to have ended it only halfway through the series, to me, feels like a failure. It should have either gone all the way or not existed at all. But there's just no way to know at the beginning of the process how difficult it's going to be, how long it's going to last. And it turns out that it just kind of fell apart. So if there's any shows, any podcasts I was involved with that I always kind of cringe about because they didn't go really where I wanted them to, never really built the way I wanted them to, or they ended unceremoniously, it's Other Voices, Sith Eye, the sub-series from the Butlerniverse, and Star Wars Reports Rebels Roundtable. I wish it had been able to go on longer, or we had just not started it at all. But that's kind of the way it goes sometimes. So my advice would be, hey, there's going to be more, so don't lose heart. You will eventually get to see the other stuff, even if you don't get to cover it as a show. But also, you know that whole Rebels thing? Just enjoy it as a viewer. Find other ways maybe to cover it or talk about it, because the chances of making this work and catching lightning in a bottle the way you did for Republic Forces Radio Network for an extended period of time again are pretty slim. Don't put yourself through that and leave people unsatisfied and frustrated that you didn't cover the entire series. That, I think, would be the advice I would have given to the team back then. As for the Patreon, you asked about the Patreon stuff. So there's 3 tiers on the Patreon. The first tier is the $1 tier that I call the Travelers Through the But Learniverse. And basically what that does is when I do those monthly project update videos, there are 3 more of those to go, April, May, and June. I will say out loud in those episodes, you know, hey, thanks to the members of the different tiers, and I'll list off everybody. They also show up in the credits at the end of those episodes. If and when I do another edition of a Saga on Home video, or like a supplemental book or something to go with that, they also get thanked in the Patreon credits on those in those books, as anyone up to a certain point already did in a Saga on Home video 2nd edition. The trick there, of course, being that they do need to actually have been paid supporters, right? Somebody could jump in just long enough to get their name mentioned in one of the project updates and then jump out without ever being billed. That's not a real supporter, and dude, it's a free rider problem thing. I wound up mentioning their name when I shouldn't have because they didn't actually contribute anything. I can at least double check for the book stuff and say, oh, I may have said your name on the episode, but you actually weren't a true supporter in the end because you bailed before there was any billing that happened. You didn't actually financially contribute a damn thing. You're not in the book. So those are those 2. There is sort of a difference in the approach to those, but I can't guarantee that anymore because I don't know if there'll be like another supplemental edition or anything like that for a Saga on Home video ever, for all that I know. I mean, there might be, but it wouldn't be anytime in the near future. But I will be keeping track of all the names of anybody who supported up to that point from the financial sense. Then you got the $5 tier, that is the Denizens of the But Learniverse. These folks get access to what the $1 tier got, but also get exclusive audio commentaries that I put together as MP3s. Basically, they're MP3 files that you can start playing. It'll be like, you know, hello, this is Nathan P. Butler. Let me thank you up front for being a backer of my Patreon. Blah, 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 blah. This commentary can be played while watching episode such and such of whatever. I'll count down from 3, and I'll say play when the countdown hits 0. Hit play at that moment, and you should be able to watch right along with me. It's the idea of basically you pause the audio or you pause your show you're watching, and then when I say 0, or I say play actually, when I hit 0, you unpause, and it's like watching a commentary built into a DVD or a Blu-ray as I do commentary throughout the entire episode live, kind of as if I was sitting there in the room, you know, talking out loud with you while you're watching it. I have created those for every single episode of the Clone Wars, so that's 133 episodes plus the film, so 134 total for the Clone Wars, plus all 4 of the collected editions, or volumes as they call them, of Forces of Destiny, plus all 6 episodes released thus far of Tales of the Jedi. So Tales of the Jedi, basically season or series 1. So that is 144 audio commentary MP3s that are available on the Patreon. And the way these tiers work, it's not like when you sign in on a particular tier, you get access just to the stuff that was released while you were aboard. So at this point, someone who jumps in at the $5 tier can get all 144 of those commentaries downloaded before the Patreon shuts down and have them to listen to while they watch Tales of the Jedi, Forces of Destiny, or the Clone Wars in the future. The way those were released was since 2017, it's been 2 episodes or 2 commentaries for the Clone Wars per month, and then like Forces of Destiny or Tales of the Jedi were like little bonuses on, you know, other weeks here and there just as I got time. The last of those was the last episode for the Clone Wars that was released as a commentary on April 1st. So just recently that wrapped up. There are no more commentaries coming, so it is safe right now if you want to get all the commentaries to jump in for that $5 tier, download them all, and only be a member for the month, hopefully actually letting yourself get billed at the beginning of the next month before canceling, to be able to actually have access to all of that stuff. I know there is a constant free rider problem with this thing. It's the nature of the Patreon. And then the last tier is the $10 tier, the Nobility of the But Learniverse tier, and they get what everybody else got, plus every month they are able to ask questions in a collection thread, and at the beginning of the following month I go through and I answer all those questions in an exclusive, kind of informal but longer form Q&A episode, kind of like these, except with a little bit more depth, a little bit more focus to the questions, and not really picking and choosing what's being answered, but actually answering all the things that are typically being asked, unless, as I've said to them before, I don't think it's a big issue anymore, you know, anything to not put my job or marriage in jeopardy, or whatever, I think is how I put it. They get access to that as well. The last of those will be at the beginning of May using questions posted in April. There will be no more after that. And I mention that because the Patreon, as I've said before, is ending. The way it's going to work is the commentaries are now done, 144 out there total. At the beginning of May, we will have the last of the Q&As, number 65. And at the beginning of June, right after the billing cycle, where it basically bills anybody who is a backer from May for their participation in the Patreon, once that's done in early June, I will cut off the Patreon entirely. You will not be able to get access to the podcast commentaries anymore. And those who are members of the nobility, at least there at the end, should still have the ability to watch those videos after the fact, the way that I've set them up. But the commentaries themselves will be gone and no longer available at all anywhere. As to the project update videos where I actually name people's names and, have them in the credits and everything, that is something that we would still do for April, still do for May, and I'll still do in June just in case we need to catch anybody who maybe signed up right after I did the May one or something to make sure everybody gets a chance to get that mention. And then those are done as far as regular monthly things. I will still be doing project updates from time to time. It won't be monthly anymore, and they will not involve a thanks for the Patreon supporters or anything like that anymore. They'll just be quick, like, state of the channel type of updates. So yeah, so if you're interested in it, if you want to get in on the Q&A, get in on it quickly. Get on it in April so you can ask a question for that one, and stick around so that you can actually see the video pop up in May. But as far as anything in relation to the commentaries and whatnot, you could sign up really at any point now and be able to get access to all of them. Just know they will be going away. So if you are someone who really is interested in that sort of thing, it is sort of a limited time type deal. But I tried to give as much time as I could, right? The last one releases in April, beginning of April. So we've got all of April, all of May, and those first few days of June for somebody who's really interested to jump in there and pick them up. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. And if you are someone who does jump in, remember there is a private RSS feed based on your subscriptions or whatever you want to call it through Patreon. So you can just set that up in your podcatcher and download the episodes. You don't have to go to them individually as you go through. But thanks for the interest here. I do feel like of all the podcasting stuff that I've done, this has been the thing that has taken the most time, possibly, at least on my own, and has been the thing that is probably the least useful and least listened to when it comes to those commentaries, because typically the Patreon only has, I think it maxed out at probably like 50 or so people. Typically it's around 30. A fair number of those are the $1 tier who don't even get access to the commentaries, and of the people who access the commentaries, I don't know how many are actually bothering to download or listen to the things. I feel like to some degree they're sort of shouting into the wind to an extent. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, hear me bring that, context-based, discussion to those commentaries, then now's the time to get them, because they won't be around for very long. That, of course, by the way, I didn't mention it, is patreon.com/Nathan P. Butler, if you're looking for that. So the link that's down there. All right, folks, those are all the questions for this mini Q&A number 20. Again, if you want questions in number 21, make sure to drop your questions into the comments here under number 20. I will not answer any of them here in the comments unless you specifically tell me you want me to answer here, not in the next Q&A video, whenever that may be. I think the last one was in November, so it has been a while. Can be nice long stretches in between. But thank you all for your interest in the mini Q&As. We'll be doing more of these in the future, especially once the Patreon wraps up and we're not doing any Nobility of the Butlerverse Q&As anymore. So hope to see what kind of questions you are interested in asking here. Thanks.